Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another virtual coffee break. Today we have a special guest. He is the director of the Center for Clinical Epidemiology and Population Health at Marshfield Clinic Research Institute and a current member of the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, Influenza, and COVID-19 work. Please welcome Dr. Belongia.
Okay, thank you very much. Delighted to be here this morning and have an opportunity to chat about flu vaccine. I've been working on flu vaccine issues for at least 15 years now. I'm a physician and a full-time researcher at the Marshfield Clinic Research Institute. And my work focuses primarily on vaccines and vaccine preventable diseases, particularly influenza, and now most recently COVID-19. But today I'm going to talk about flu vaccines and vaccine effectiveness. We'll go to the first slide, I guess. And let's go to slideshow mode. Okay. I just want to sort of cover a little background on the flu virus and flu vaccines and how they work and what we do to measure the effectiveness of flu vaccines. Then, during the end, if folks have questions, I'll be happy to address those, including any questions about COVID-19 vaccines. So just a quick overview on the flu virus. It's helpful to know a little bit about the flu virus to understand how the vaccine works. The flu viruses come in more flavors than Ben and Jerry's ice cream. The main category, influenza viruses are classified basically based on hemagglutinin, which on the right-hand side are kind of the ping pong ball knobby things sticking out of the virus. And something called neuraminidase, or NA, which are the little spiky points coming out of the virus on the right-hand side. And it turns out the hemagglutinin is what really drives the immune response, and that's sort of the target of vaccines. And vaccines essentially are trying to get your immune system to look for the hemagglutinin and kill the virus. So we also have influenza B viruses. And circulating in humans right now, we have basically four main groups of flu viruses. We have what's called an H1N1 strain. That's the pandemic strain that started in 2009. And then we have an H3N2 strain that's been around since 1968. And then we have two different types of B virus that are circulating in people as well. Now, flu causes a lot of disease in the United States every winter. And I think many people don't realize it because they think of flu as sort of a mild illness that just resolves on its own. And in many people, that's true. But particularly in young children and older adults, it can cause very severe illness. And this pyramid shows sort of the range of illnesses that it causes. On the bottom of the pyramid, you see 9 to 45 million illnesses every year, but then 140,000 to over 800,000 hospitalizations every year, and somewhere between 12 and 61,000 people die of the flu every year. And these are overall estimates, and it varies quite a bit from season to season, but overall, it's a very severe disease causing winter illness. Now, in addition, though, to seasonal flu, we need to worry about pandemic flu. And pandemic has been on everybody's mind for the past 8 months. Actually, influenza was thought to be the most likely source of a pandemic until COVID-19 occurred. Flu A viruses are found in over 50 species of migratory birds, ducks, and geese. And there are many, many different strains of flu viruses that are always changing and swapping genes and evolving. And these viruses can spread to domestic birds, animals, or humans. So there are three things that need to happen for a pandemic. You have to have a new animal virus that jumps to a susceptible human population. The virus must cause serious disease, and it must easily spread from person to person. And obviously, we all know now that COVID-19 hits all of those. But there's certainly a potential for a flu virus to do exactly the same thing, and it could happen at any time. There have been 5 pandemics in modern history. The first one was in 1918, which was called the Great Spanish Influenza at the time. And it wasn't until many decades later that we learned that that was an avian virus that jumped into humans and caused over 600,000 people in the US to die over 3 pandemic waves. And then there was another one in 1957 that was another avian virus that swapped genes with the human virus. And then in 1968, and then the 2009 one that many of us recall, and there's a typo, there should be H1N1, that actually was a relatively mild pandemic. The number of deaths was not very large compared to a normal seasonal flu virus, but it was a new strain. And then, of course, we're all familiar with what's happening right now with SARS-CoV-2 that jumped from bats to humans in a way that we have not yet figured out yet. And currently, now I think the last I saw, we're up to around 275,000 deaths in the United States from COVID-19. And we're still in the middle of a severe and increasing pandemic wave. Okay, so I'm going to sort of switch now from pandemics to really focusing on the seasonal flu vaccine and how it was developed. And I do think it's very interesting to sort of look back on this now as we race to develop COVID-19 vaccines in record time and the science behind that, because we're standing on the shoulders of scientists over the past 6 decades that have been working on developing vaccines. In the 1940s, a group of scientists in the Army actually worked on developing flu viruses that could be grown in chicken eggs. And by being able to grow these viruses in chicken eggs, they could then produce large amounts of them and purify them and inactivate them. And then basically they began experimenting with vaccines. And the goal at that point actually was to protect the military, because remember, this was World War II era. And there was great concern about what flu could do to our military capability. People who were alive then doing this work remembered very well what happened in 1918 when there was no effective response to the pandemic. So they found that challenging people with this inactivated vaccine protected them if they infect them with the flu virus. And they also developed an antibody test that was able to measure the immune response that would correlate with the protection against becoming ill. So there are a few interesting things about flu vaccines that make them different from most other vaccines. For example, there are many different subtypes and strains circulating. So we can't just make one vaccine against one flu virus. The vaccines have to contain multiple different subtypes. And we have to update these vaccines every year because the viruses in the real world are always evolving and changing. And so the vaccine has to be updated to keep up with the viruses that are changing in the world. So that's a process called antigenic drift. So in order to do that, then the World Health Organization has a committee of experts that meets twice a year to select the strains that will go into the flu vaccine. And they meet in February to select the strains for the Northern Hemisphere. Those are the vaccines that you'll be getting the next fall. And they meet in September to select the flu vaccines for the Southern Hemisphere. So the process involves producing the vaccine in eggs. And this is essentially a process that has been going on for over 6 decades. And it takes 7 or 8 months to sort of go through the entire sequence from selecting the virus strain to actually putting vaccine in people's arms. And that's because they have to, after they select the virus strain, they have to adapt it to grow in eggs. And then they have to actually, grow it and purify it and harvest it from the eggs, and then split it up so it's inactive. There's no living virus anymore. And then they have to test it for potency to make sure it contains what it's supposed to contain. And then finally, put it in vials and ship it and deliver it. So that whole process takes 8 to 10 months. And you can't speed it up very much. There's a sequence that you have to go through. It's not very adaptable to last minute changes. So our field studies of vaccine effectiveness involve enrolling patients who come in with a respiratory illness during the winter. We consent them. We collect a swab that we test for the flu virus using a molecular test that's very accurate. People who are flu positive we call cases. And the people who are negative for the flu virus are called controls. And essentially, by comparing the rate of vaccination in the cases and the controls, we can get an estimate as to the level of protection the vaccine is providing. And so I just want to share a few results from the last season, 2019-20. We reported out after the first 3 weeks in January, our interim assessment of vaccine protection last winter. This just shows the number of cases. Okay, so continuing on. So this just shows the flu cases occurring last winter. I'll just move on to the next one. And this table shows our estimate of vaccine effectiveness. Overall, on the top row, on the right-hand side, you can see the overall vaccine effectiveness was 45% last winter. And it varied a bit by age group. It was actually highest in children and adolescents, and somewhat lower in adults 18 to 49. And there's another network that measures vaccine effectiveness for flu hospital admission, and that's called the Haven Network. And this slide compares the vaccine effectiveness in our network, which is the outpatient illness network, and the hospital network. On the left-hand side, you can see it's very similar, 41% and 36% for the overall vaccine effectiveness. And pretty similar if we take that down to the level of the specific strain, the H1N1 strain or the B virus strain in the other two boxes. So the Holy Grail is a universal flu vaccine. We would love to get that because the seasonal vaccines do not offer an extremely high level of protection, as you could see in the data I just showed you. And they have to be updated regularly. And we would really like to have a vaccine that works against most, if not all, different flu strains, and also, very importantly, would protect against a new pandemic strain that might jump into the human population. We currently have a vaccine stockpile in the US for potential pandemic viruses, but they become out of date. They cost a lot of money to maintain. And they may not work against whatever the pandemic virus ends up being. So universal vaccine is the Holy Grail. There are a lot of challenges on this in terms of regulatory and scientific challenges, but I must say that the sort of scientific revolution we've experienced in the past 10 months with the very rapid clinical development of COVID-19 vaccines, I think we're going to see real spin-off benefits from that effort toward developing universal flu vaccines in the future. So the goal is to develop strong and long-lasting protection, reduce transmission, and then cover both seasonal and pandemic viruses. So you may wonder, well, what's going on right now with flu? Not very much, and that's good news. This is a slide from the World Health Organization for the Northern Hemisphere showing flu viruses. And on the x-axis, you see the week of the year. So, week 1 was the beginning of January in 2020. So what you see on the graph on the left-hand side is basically last season's flu activity. And we currently have virtually no activity at all in North America. And that's good news. And it mirrors what the Southern Hemisphere saw in June, July, and August, where they had very little flu activity. And it's current thinking is that efforts to control COVID are having an effect on flu transmission, although I think it's more complicated than that. Certainly, we have a lot of COVID transmission going on right now, and we have a firestorm of COVID across much of the United States. And so there's some interesting things going on in terms of flu, and it's too early to predict right now. I never make predictions on flu viruses and what's going to happen next. But as of right now, anyway, we're seeing a lot less flu activity than what we would normally see at this time of year in the US. And so that's good, and we hope that continues. and certainly to the extent that people wear a mask and keep their distance from other people and avoid indoor gatherings for COVID, that is certainly going to have spin-off benefits for preventing flu as well, and protecting our not only the population, but preventing an overload of our healthcare systems that are already stretched to the limit in dealing with people who have severe COVID-19. I just want to end by thanking our flu team and our COVID team. And just as a disclaimer, this picture was taken in 2019 before the pandemic, and that's why nobody's wearing a mask. With that, I will stop sharing my screen and be happy to take questions. Nathan, I'm not getting any audio from you.
There we go. How about now?
Now I can hear you.
Excellent. So I just was saying apologies for the technical errors. We just had a short disconnect, but I'm glad we're back up. So a first question that came through, what concerns do you have regarding the flu season and COVID-19 occurring at the same time this year?
Well, yeah, just like I just mentioned, that's a real concern. A bad flu season on top of COVID would be a disaster, both for our communities as well as our hospitals. They're already stretched to the max dealing with COVID. People with flu also require ICU beds, they require hospital care. And so we need to do everything we can to tamp down flu and minimize flu. Right now it looks good. But like I said, I'm not making any predictions about what it's going to be in 1 or 2 months. But we hope it'll continue to be as low as it is. Over.
All right. And the next question we had is, has there been any increase in viruses jumping from animal to human in recent years? And in what ways does the virus jump from animals to human?
No, I'm not aware that there's been any increase, but this does happen periodically with flu viruses. There have been, it's a fairly regular occurrence with flu viruses, but what has not happened is we have not had a flu virus jump to humans from animals and then cause serious illness and spread easily from person to person. So we have avian flu viruses that are very deadly in people. They have 30–40% mortality in humans. And people can get those because the domestic animals such as chickens can become infected with those viruses, and then humans get exposed to the domestic animals that are infected and become infected. But again, the good news so far on that is that those viruses do not easily spread from one person to another person. So the human ends up being a dead-end transmission line, and it doesn't continue beyond that, in contrast to COVID-19, where it's very easily transmitted from one person to another. Over.
All right, thank you. Another question that just came through, are they doing primarily COVID testing and not doing flu testing like they normally would when people come in with symptoms?
Yeah, that's true. They are primarily doing COVID testing and not doing much flu testing, and there are a couple reasons for that. One is, as I mentioned, there's very little flu activity in the state right now, and we know that because the state lab in Madison is getting samples from all around the state, and they're reporting out weekly, and they're not seeing flu. So we're pretty confident that there's not very much flu activity that we're missing. And then the other factor, though, is the fact that testing is a bottleneck. And while the Marshfield Clinic has done an amazing job of ramping up to produce for high volume testing, the reagents and the supplies needed to run the COVID tests and the flu tests are mostly the same. And so we have a finite supply of the testing materials, and we need to prioritize that for COVID because that's the problem we're dealing with right now that's most urgent. Over.
All right, thank you. And one more question that just came through. Should people feel confident that a COVID vaccine will be safe if approved for use?
Yes, I think it's a great question. I think the thing to watch very carefully is in the next 2 weeks, there'll be meetings of advisory committees for the FDA. The FDA is the regulatory agency that will authorize the use of these vaccines on an emergency basis. It's not the same as licensure, but the scientific review process is not cutting any corners. They're not relaxing the standards to approve these vaccines. And the first line of review will be an external advisory panel to the FDA. So these are independent experts that are vetted, that don't have a conflict of interest, and they are going to carefully review all the data on safety and efficacy and make a recommendation to the FDA, an official formal recommendation. And this is a transparent process. You can watch it online as they discuss it. And the FDA, I hope and believe will follow the recommendation of this advisory group. So if the FDA, if the group recommends the vaccine be approved based on scientific evidence of safety and efficacy, the FDA authorizes it. Then a CDC Advisory Committee called ACIP will also weigh in on this. And again, that's another independent advisory panel of experts that will also look at the same data and make recommendations about use of the vaccine in the American population. And they will vote on it. And again, that's another transparent, open process, and they will look very carefully at the science for safety and efficacy, as well as other considerations such as equity and feasibility and implementation. And if both of those committees endorse this vaccine, I will be right. As soon as it's my turn to get vaccinated, I will get vaccinated with no hesitation. I think people can trust these committees and their decision. So, stay tuned, but I'm very optimistic and hopeful based on everything we've seen so far that we're going to have two vaccines that are both with very strong evidence for both efficacy and safety that are recommended by independent advisory groups. Over.
I agree. Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. And just so everyone knows, if you do have questions after the live presentation, we will forward those questions to Dr. Belongia. So all questions will be answered. But one more time for just one more live. Will we need yearly COVID vaccines like we do the flu vaccine?
Yeah, that's a great question. At this point, we don't know. All we know at this point, based on the news reports of the phase 3 trials and the recent information from the UK, where they have actually licensed the Pfizer vaccine. And so a regulatory body in the UK has reviewed all the data and concluded that it's effective and safe. But we don't know. People have been followed only for a few weeks after getting these vaccines. And as people are followed for a longer period of time in these trials, and we see how the level of protection is and the antibody levels after 3 months and 6 months, we'll start to get an idea of sort of the rate of decline of protection and how long that protection is going to last. So, it's certainly possible it could be like a flu vaccine where you're going to need a booster every year. It's also possible that it'll last longer. I think we just don't know. I think, we do know that for the seasonal coronaviruses, these are the coronaviruses that cause the common cold and have been around in humans for a long time. That immunity does not last very long, and it declines, and then you can become reinfected. But this is a little different, and these are very potent vaccines, and so I just think the jury's out. I think it's certainly possible this would be an annual vaccine, but perhaps not. Perhaps it'll last longer. Over.
All right. Thank you so much. Well, with that, it concludes our virtual presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Belongia, for sharing your time with us.
Okay.
We all really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Okay. Thank you. Bye now.
All right. Bye.